Alright everybody, welcome to my test episode of Philosophy with Phil. I thought it'd be fun, I got this windshield mount for my phone. Thought I could talk, while driving around we could talk philosophy for a while. And I want to see how the sound works, I want to see how the video quality works. So, just a test episode, see what's going on. So one of the things I wanted to talk about today, since I'm starting to formulate my classes for my online classes for the summer, I'm teaching some of the undergrad summer sessions, and so I'm getting my syllabus together and all that good stuff. But I've been thinking a lot though about the method of procedure in philosophy, and I was thinking back to honestly some of the classes of introduction to philosophy classes. Now, the class I'm teaching over the summer is an ethics class, so it's not exactly an introduction. But still there is a question of procedure, and that's actually what motivated my musings for today. So some of my former students from years ago, when I taught high school, sometimes will still email me, and they'll ask about their intro to philosophy classes, wherein they bring up, all kinds of questions, and the one I'm going to use as my example is they will go over St. Thomas Aquinas' 5 arguments for God's existence that he gives in the Summa Theologiae in the first part, right? Question 2, Article 3. And they'll email me about this, asking about these 5 arguments for God's existence, and the question and why I wanted to talk about this today is, why would you do that in an intro to philosophy class? Right? So I know that the question of God and God's existence is indeed a philosophical question. It's a metaphysical question. To a certain extent, it's a question in natural philosophy. Also, that's where Aristotle gives his first argument for the existence of God at the end of the Physics. But when St. Thomas is going through his 5 ways, right? The 5 arguments that he gives for God's existence. First of all, as the name implies, it is a summa, it's a summary. He's giving you kind of a rundown of the argument. And so St. Thomas is presupposing on the part of his students that you've already read Aristotle's Physics, you've already read Aristotle's Metaphysics, and that you're familiar with the longer forms of these arguments given in those texts. And of course, even to study the metaphysics, to study the physics, requires a lot of work on its own, right? So St. Thomas is kind of presupposing that you've got some background in this. It's not something that you can give to an undergraduate freshman just starting out in philosophy, because what, have they studied the philosophy of nature? Have they studied metaphysics first? And if they haven't, and you shouldn't study metaphysics first anyway, but you get my point. If they haven't studied those things, having them evaluate and examine arguments for God's existence is really pointless, because they're not in a position where they can evaluate those arguments for God's existence, because they don't have the background for it yet, right? So you wouldn't start an intro to physics class. An intro physics class with having your students examine quantum mechanical equations, right? That would just be foolish. And yeah, even though quantum mechanics is a part of physics, these are physics questions, in an intro class, your students don't have the background necessary for that. They're just not ready. So it is in philosophy, and trying to look at, the arguments for God's existence when you're just starting out in philosophy, right? So the way that you would teach this, and so that kind of begs the question, is, well, how do you start? What should an introduction to philosophy consist in? What do you do for a real intro philosophy class? So the way that I do this, since there really aren't, that I've seen, that many real intro to philosophy classes that follow this pattern of study. So there's a really, really good book that I have all my students buy, because I use it for the ethics class, I use it for the philosophy of nature class, I use it for everything. And it's the basic works of Aristotle. It comes in a little paperback. Well, not little, it's about yay big, but comes in a paperback edition. And it's got most of Aristotle's like really important works, and and they usually follow an order. And so if you get the basic works of Aristotle, you open it up, the first selection of works that you come to, and I think that this follows for even teaching philosophy in the first place, is Aristotle's works on logic. Right? And I think that's, if you were to ask me, in what does a true introduction to philosophy consist? A true introduction to philosophy consists in learning the art of logic. Because it's in logic, at least as Aristotle goes through it, you learn what the most basic principles are, and you learn the art of thinking itself. Right? Aristotle's very clear, and of course the tradition following Aristotle is very clear that in order to learn anything at all, you need to have the principles of learning in you. And of course the principles of learning, the art by which you are able to learn, is logic. And if you don't have logic, you're not going to be able to learn the rest of it, right? You can't go into the philosophy of nature. You can't really go into mathematics, at least not that well. You certainly can't go into metaphysics or any of the other branches of philosophy, which in the end reduce back to one of those three things. So it's in the logic. Aristotle's logic begins, of course, with the work on the categories, right? The 10 most basic concepts of the mind. Because as he starts out, when we speak about things, we either speak of them in a complex manner or in a simple manner. And if he gives an example of a simple manner, when we say something like man, ox, horse, whatever. Simple ideas. And then, of course, complex sentences. Most people know what a complex sentence is, right? The man runs. Something like that, right? Multiple ideas, multiple simple ideas together. And so the work of the categories is dedicated to the 10 broadest notions of simplicity. Right? The 10 categories, the 10 categories, the simple categories, back to which everything will reduce. Of course, the 10 categories, just to list them: substance, quantity, quality, relation, time, place, state, position, action, and passion. And everything that we talk about will reduce back to one of those 10 categories, right? The things that are most simple. And then Aristotle, once you know the basic categories, the simple concepts of the mind, then Aristotle, the next work on interpretation, moves into the formulation of sentences. And it's actually in this that the connection between logic and grammar becomes most apparent, and I would love to see that happen in education when we teach students grammar, to be able to connect it back to the idea of logic, right? If logic is about the way we think about things, then grammar is the way that we write about what we think, which ultimately is still a reflection of things in themselves. Which is why logic has a certain order. It's why grammar has a certain order. It's because reality has a certain order. And then once you've mastered those things, I'm just kind of spitballing ideas today. Once you've mastered those things, then you start in Aristotle the books of the analytics, the prior and the posterior analytics, where now Aristotle tries to show you, now that you know what the simple concepts are, now that you can make complex propositions, now Aristotle teaches you how to reason in the books of the analytics, how to make an actual argument. And it's in the posterior analytics. The prior analytics is dedicated to the formulation of argument, how you argue. And the posterior analytics is dedicated to the notion of a science. What a science is, in what a science consists, the scope of a science, how you have a science, the whole works. And if you're unclear on the mode, the manner, and method of presentation of a science, then you aren't going to be able to, first of all, move into mathematics, which are sciences, and for this, one of the greatest math textbooks that's ever been written, probably the greatest math textbook that's ever been written in the history of Western civilization, is Euclid's Elements, which is presented in the exact mode of an Aristotelian science. It's why it's probably the greatest math textbook that's ever been written. You also then won't understand the sciences of philosophy. Right? Natural philosophy, which is connected to, even today, mathematical physics, chemistry, and biology. You need to have an understanding of the philosophy of nature first in order to productively enter into these sciences and to see their scope within the wider framework of knowledge, and I'll talk about that next time. And I think one of my other videos I'll do too, maybe the next one I'll do, is my justification for why I use Aristotle so much. And then the next one I'll do after that is this mode and the scope of knowledge. And therefore why the philosophy of nature has to be done before you can do physics, chemistry, biology. But more on that next time. At any rate, if you're unclear on what Aristotle means by a science, and what he means by science, he connects it to our faculty of learning, the mode and manner in which human beings, as human beings, this is just the way that we learn, it's the way that we teach, right? The way we instruct others, and it's how knowledge comes to us. So if you're missing all of this that you get in the logic, everything that you get in the logic, if you've skipped that and you just try to enter into the sciences of learning, philosophy, mathematics, physics, so on and so forth, whatever, right? Without starting in logic, you're going to run into some problems. Right? So, anyway, this was just a test episode today, test video. I wanted to see if the audio comes across real well. I wanted to see if maybe I could pull this off, because I think this would be fun. Drive around, talk about philosophy. Today, I just wanted to talk about the importance of logic, and why, using the example from some of my students, it just doesn't make sense to treat of something as advanced as the arguments for the existence of God in an introduction to philosophy class, just because they're not in a position to be able to judge of those arguments. You have to do other things first. And if there's a mode and an order to our learning, then the thing that you have to do absolutely first is logic. You have to start with logic in order for anything else that comes afterwards to make any kind of sense at all. And I don't know, hopefully I've managed to get that idea across just a little bit, but mostly this was to see whether or not this kind of venue works for this kind of thing. Thanks guys for checking out this video. If you liked it, thumbs up. If not, I'd be interested to hear about it in the comments, what I could improve on, or if there are any topics, philosophical topics you'd like me to talk about while we drive around and have some fun. I'd be interested to hear about those things too. So you guys have a great day. Take care. Talk to you later.